Hello there. My name is Michael Sherman, and I work in Carlow College, St. Patrick's, in the heart of Carlow town. I lecture there, and my discipline is theology, and I've been there now for about 10 years or so. And I'm delighted to meet you all virtually via this lecture that I have prepared on one of the aspects that comes up on the Leaving Cert paper for religious studies. So I hope you can see my PowerPoint okay, and I'm just going to take you through some ideas that I've put together that might help students and staff prepare for the Leaving Cert exam. So I've picked a topic on the course, on the Leaving Cert course, called Christianity, Origins and Contemporary Expressions. And I'm going to prepare you, I've prepared a question, I should say, and I hope it will help you prepare for this topic in the Leaving Cert. I'm going to focus on the bottom one here, which is examining contemporary religious and Christian identity in the light of our understanding of its founding vision and its earliest expressions. So the key words here are contemporary and earliest expressions. Contemporary religious and Christian identity as a way of understanding its founding vision and its earliest expressions. So they kind of will feed into each other. Okay, if you want to understand the present better, you need to have a good sense of the past. Okay, but they feed into each other, and I hope to explore that a little bit as we move through this lecture. I've picked a question from last year's Leaving Cert paper, and I also looked at the mock papers down in at least in Carlow and Kilkenny, and it was a very similar mock paper. And the question I'm going to look at is explore the effect that returning to the original teaching of Jesus of Nazareth had on members of liberation theology. And so that got me thinking about, well, what are the original expressions of Christianity? And one of the most famous scenes in the New Testament is the Sermon on the Mountain, or the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus talks to people, talks to his disciples, talks to his followers, and to everyone there about blessings. And these blessings, which became known as Beatitudes, are fundamental sources when it comes to understanding Christianity as it's lived out in terms of spirituality, in terms of activism, in terms of advocacy, in terms of relationship with God, relationship with yourself, relationship with others. So I thought it'd be a good topic to pick. The Beatitudes, we'll see later on, form part of the teachings that were embraced by liberation theologians in the 1960s. They were marrying gospel values, particularly those of the Beatitudes, with contemporary philosophy and political ideologies of the 50s and 60s, but the philosophy of the 19th century and early 20th century do inform the thinking around the thinking that these liberation theologians employed to do their work. And then when I explore that with you, then I'm going to bring us up to more recent contemporary expressions of liberation theology, and indeed the Beatitudes, implicitly and explicitly in the writings of contemporary hip hop, particularly Kendrick Lamar. So I'm going to get straight into it. This will take hopefully no more than an hour, but we'll get straight into it now and see how we go. The Beatitudes, they're very interesting. You will see they're listed here, and every sentence begins with the word blessed, blessed, blessed. It's not your normal conversation type text, right? Conversation type language. It's almost like a rap. Blessed are the poor, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, and so on. So what is a beatitude? Beatitude inherited its blessedness from the Latin word beatus, meaning both happy and blessed. The noun beatitude refers to a state of great joy. Being blessed, or at least feeling blessed, is often likened to that word beatitude. And you'll see them here. There are sayings attributed to Jesus. I have them summarized here on the next slide in short form. Blessed are the poor, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, the hunger and thirst, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, those who are persecuted because of righteousness. So you can begin to see a theme emerging here. Those who are marginalized, those who are bullied, those who are forgotten, those who have experienced injustice, those who are mocked for expressing their relationship with God, and so on. They became kind of famous in the world of entertainment in the 1979 film, The Life of Brian, a brilliant film, really, by the Monty Pythons. And I have it here. This PowerPoint now I will circulate with you all via Nerily, our head of marketing. But and when you get the PowerPoint, you can look at these clips yourself. I won't play them now because I've done a few trial runs and they don't sound great. But needless to say, just look up the Sermon on the Mount, Life of Brian, and it's extremely well shot. It begins with an actor playing Jesus, a very close up of this man on the mountain, looking like a first century Messiah, and he's preaching and he's talking about these beatitudes. Blessed are the poor, for they shall inherit the earth, and so on. And then it slowly zooms out right across and right to the back of the crowd, where you have a group of people trying to interpret and understand and represent what's being said by this figure way up the front. It's a very good text, but it also does critique the foolishness sometimes of humans when we speak first and don't listen twice and look twice. So it's a very good exploration of how of the role that tradition plays, the role that the interpretation of texts play, and how it can be very dangerous to be making, I suppose, fundamentalist statements around faith and interpreting biblical texts. The Beatitudes, they are attributed to the sayings of Jesus, and they played a significant role in shaping the foundations of Christianity by emphasizing values and, I suppose, principles by which Christians could live by. And they became central Christian teachings and practices. And I have outlined some ways in how they have influenced the origins of Christianity. So I have 5 outlined here. I have the ethical framework, spiritual focus, community building, hope and encouragement, and mission and outreach. So in terms of an ethical framework, these Beatitudes provided a moral and ethical framework that guided early Christians in their behavior and in their interactions with others. Values such as humility, mercy, and peacemaking become integral to Christian ethics. In terms of spirituality and the spiritual focus that the Beatitudes highlight, well, they highlight spiritual qualities like poor in spirit, pure in heart. And the Beatitudes in this way encouraged a focus on the inner life, on your interiority, on your spiritual growth, and in a way, they're there to help one deepen their relationship with God. And this became also a cornerstone of Christian spirituality. But it wasn't all just about looking in, right? It's also about looking out. And it's not just meeting God in yourself, but also meeting God in the community. And so the teachings fostered a sense of community among believers, encouraging them to support and to comfort one another, especially those who are being persecuted. There's a whole history of the persecution of early Christians, of Christians in the early years of the church, which is continuing up to today. This sense of solidarity, of community building, helped strengthen the early Christian communities. Another aspect another aspect of the Beatitudes, or if you like, an effect of them, or a knock-on effect of them, was the idea of hope and encouragement. The promises of blessings, for example. There's a real promise there. Don't worry, don't give up. It's not all over. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are the, why are they blessed? Because they will inherit, because they will receive. Knock and the door shall be opened, so to speak. So the promises and blessings and rewards for those who embody the Beatitudes provided hope and encouragement, especially during the times of persecution and hardship. So the Beatitudes were a way of helping sustain the faith and the commitment to the early Christian community and the faith of the early Christians. And a fifth aspect is mission and outreach. Very important, because faith with no action arguably is no faith at all. So the emphasis on peacemaking, for example, and on mercy inspired early Christians to engage in acts of charity and outreach, spreading the message of love and compassion to others, which was crucial for the growth of the early Christian movement, and arguably is what is sustaining it. In terms of the connection between the Beatitudes then and liberation theology, they are closely connected. And I'll speak a little bit first about the close connection before I go into some detail about liberation theology itself, its origins, its philosophical and theological influences, and then its contemporary expressions. So the link between Lib Theol and the Beatitudes, they're closely connected through their shared emphasis on justice and the preferential option for the poor. And there are links between these two, between the Beatitudes and liberation theology. The first one is the preferential option for the poor. Liberation theology, which emerged in Latin America in the 20th century, emphasizes the need to prioritize the poor and the oppressed in both theology and practice. And this aligns with the Beatitudes, particularly blessed are the poor in spirit and blessed are those who mourn. This highlights God's special concern for the marginalized and the suffering. The second aspect is social justice. Both the Beatitudes and liberation theology advocate for social justice. The Beatitudes call for mercy, peacekeeping, and righteousness, which are foundational to the pursuit of justice and equality in society. And in that sense, liberation theology builds on the principles laid out in the Beatitudes in addressing systemic injustices, and advocating for the rights of the oppressed. It's not, or I should say, another area of liberation that it focuses on is spiritual liberation and material liberation. So the Beatitudes focus on spiritual blessings and the promise of God's kingdom, so kind of something that is to come. Liberation theology extends this to include material liberation from poverty and from oppression. So a liberation that is not going to be only realized in the afterlife. It's about a liberation, I suppose to quote Fat Boy Slim, right here, right now, we are not putting up with injustices anymore. And so it has a holistic approach, okay? And it sought to address, or it seeks to address, both spiritual and physical needs of individuals and communities. Another aspect that is sometimes forgotten about liberation theology, but it's really interesting, is empowerment. People taking back their power, owning their power, reclaiming themselves, being seen, and being heard. So liberation theology empowers the oppressed to take an active role in their own liberation. They don't need somebody to come over into their land or over into their life and liberate them. So it's about taking back the power and owning your own role, the role that you play, or that you are a co-player in the achievement of your own liberation. This was inspired by the Beatitudes' message of hope and blessing for those who suffer. This empowerment is seen as a way to bring about a transformative change in society. And you'll see this idea of a transformative change, not just in yourself, not just in your emotions and your feelings, in your inner life, in society. And you will see traces of, for example, Marxist theory, which I might, if I have time, say a little bit on later on. And you will see links between these. And lastly, there is the biblical foundation. Liberation theology draws heavily on the teachings of Jesus, including the Beatitudes as a biblical foundation for its principal actions. As I said earlier, the Beatitudes provide a scriptural basis for advocating for justice, for mercy, and for peace. So the Beatitudes and liberation theology are linked through their shared commitment to justice, to compassion, and the upliftment of the poor and the oppressed. They both seek to bring about a more just and equitable world inspired by the teachings of Jesus. But what is liberation theology? Well, it is a theological movement. It's a theological movement that emerged primarily in Latin America in the 1960s and from within the Roman Catholic Church. It focuses on the liberation of oppressed peoples, and it emphasizes social justice, economic equality, and political activisms. There are a number of aspects to liberation theology. As I've already said, the preferential option for the poor, socio-economic analysis and critique, political engagement, biblical interpretation, and there's also controversies and criticisms associated with liberation theology. So, for example, in terms of the preferential option for the poor, there's a prioritizing the needs and rights of the poor and the marginalizing. That would be key to liberation theologians. In terms of the socioeconomic analysis, liberation theology uses socioeconomic analysis to understand and address root causes of poverty and injustice. And it often incorporates elements of Marxist theory to critique structural inequalities. So it's not looking at just what is wrong, but looking at how it came to be wrong. Not just looking at a problem, but looking at the history and the root and the structures that facilitated the wrongs, or, well, let's just the abuses. Liberation theology, in terms of political engagement, would always advocate for one's active involvement in political and civic affairs, and in so doing, with the aim of bringing about social change. And so This includes supporting grassroots movements and community organizing. There's been a few movies made on it. One particularly good one was made in 1990, I think, Romero, based on the life of the Archbishop of El Salvador, Oscar Romero, a really fascinating character, and who himself, underwent a transformation, a social transformation, but I would say also a personal and spiritual transformation, due to his experience of working with the marginalized communities in El Salvador. And he paid the ultimate price for his life when he was assassinated. So I have on the screen here, what is liberation theology? I might just say a little bit about the philosophical and theological backgrounds to it, by way of giving you a better understanding of it. And then we might see it more than we might see it unpacked even more when we look at some of the texts of Kendrick Lamar in a few minutes. So since the late 1960s, what has come to be called liberation theology, it emerged in many parts of the world, but primarily in Latin America. And it has come to be one of the most vital forces in contemporary theology. It has many varieties. There's Latin American theology. There's Black theology from the United States. There's African theology. There's feminist theology. There's queer theology. And all of these theologies, I suppose you could call them all contextual theologies. And you could even go so far as to say there's no such thing as theology. There is only contextual theology, a theology that takes the body, the place, the person seriously and puts it at the center of its exploration. And what all the liberation theologies or contextual theologies have in common, yes, it is to seek God in our lives, but it's also, all these theologies have a commitment to liberating the oppressions, and to liberating the oppressed peoples from oppression and their solidarity with victims. But they also have in common, and what makes them especially distinctive is it is a new way of doing theology. And that's what I want to explore with you in some detail. Doing theology as a critical reflection on action. So it was there was no new content per se. There was no new major theory. There was no new information that needed to be unpacked in the 1960s, according to these liberation theologians. Rather, it was a new method or a new way of doing theology. And key to understanding this is the insight that the highest level of knowing is intelligent and responsible doing. The highest level of knowing is intelligent and responsible doing. So you have knowing linked with intelligence, linked with doing. There's a kind of a trinity at play there. And that was a reaction, if you like, to more traditional theological method that sees the theological process or the work of theology in terms of intellectual awareness. That is, theology ultimately is a quest for meaning and for understanding meaning. In this perspective, action comes afterwards. But when you apply theology, for example, to concrete pastoral situations. So I'll give it to you another way. Traditionally, it would be learn theology, now go out in a seminary or in a university, now go out into the world and apply it. Liberation theology, flip that. Okay, the learning is in the doing. Okay, there's no map. The road is created by walking it together. Very much an idea we're seeing in synodality at the minute. So liberation theology would basically disagree with the old model because it insists that theology cannot stop at the discovery of meaning. In fact, intellectual awareness does not discover the fullness of meaning at all. It is something that comes in the context of intelligent action, or what is called in the New Testament living or doing the truth. So you'll see I have a little diagram here. It's where I'm outlining that it's a new way of knowing. The highest level of knowing is intelligent and responsible doing. So it's a movement away from awareness and meaning, okay, and moving towards looking at theology as living and doing. And you will see over here this idea that knowledge is kind of dots. It's knowledge is outside of us, and we have to go out there and discover it. Right? This diagram here is about joining the dots, and we only do that through experience. Creativity is seeing how, based on our knowledge, which we discover through experience, and then when we reflect on that, we can imagine new situations, and we end up creatively responding to social questions and questions of social justice and so on. In terms of the philosophical background, there's a couple of moments in thinking that developed in the 19th century and were quite influential to the liberation theologians who were studying their theology in the 50s and in the 60s. The first of these moments is that of what's called the European Enlightenment, when after philosophers like René Descartes in the 17th century, famous French philosopher, and then Immanuel Kant in the 18th century, famous German philosopher, it was clear from the writings of these philosophical movements and these philosophers that human knowledge was a profoundly personal activity. And what this means is that an individual knower, you and me, as individuals, and as we know things, actually play a real part in the construction of the reality that is known. So think about that for a minute. An individual knower has a real part to play in constructing the reality that is known. So we kind of move from one to the next to the next. We might unpack that a little bit more. Knowledge is not of something that is objectively out there, like it's in this box here. It's out there already. In other words, human knowers in their own historical or cultural conditionedness actually participate in seeing, in understanding, and in knowing what they see and understand and know. So we are active players in our world, and we co-create our world, and we co-construct it. So this is a real, what was called in the 17th century, the turn to the subject, the turn towards intersubjectivity. So you will have heard this you might know the phrase, I think, therefore I am. This is a radical turn to the human knowing, to the human person, to the human subject. And because of the subjectivity then of our knowledge, what the Enlightenment philosophers insisted on was that we only really know something if we have personally come to know it through a personal experience and a judgment. In other words, I don't really know something unless I can verify it myself. I know something not simply because my teacher told me, or my parents told me, or the priest told me, or the lecturer told me. I know something only when I take personal responsibility for it and for my knowing it. So we're all investigators. We're curious. We inquire. We wander. We explore. We discover. All of those activities have philosophical, if you like, roots in these Enlightenment philosophers and the way they were critiquing older models of knowing. And now if you go back a couple of slides and you listen to what the liberation theologians were doing, they're using this critique of ways of knowing, and they're translating it into critiquing a way, at the older way, the old traditional way of doing theology. So it's kind of profound in a way, the idea that I know something only when I take responsibility for it. I mean, when you think of what we see on social media with information being shared that could be AI manipulated images, you think of misinformation and disinformation and malicious information. Now more than ever do we have to tell ourselves to stop, to look twice, to listen twice, to verify, to clarify before we believe something. Okay. So in that sense, I know something only when I take personal responsibility for it. And in the same way, my actions are truly moral actions only when I myself have taken responsibility for them. So it's no longer responsible to say, I'm doing this because the Bible is telling me to do it, or I'm doing this because the teacher said so. I cannot morally do something simply because I'm told to do it by my parents, or my friends, or my teachers, or because the Pope says it, or even liberation theologians would say, because tradition mandates that I do it. Okay, it is a right moral action only if it is right in my own conscience. As early as the 20th century, as early 20th century Scottish theologian John Oman puts it, I've just skipped on without it, nothing is either true faith or right morality that is not our own, and that in consequence external authority is in principle an unsound basis, and individual judgment not merely a right but a duty. So the goal of intellectual understanding, then, it's not just about my knowing and my taking responsibility for it, but to really take responsibility for it, I have to put it into action. And my knowing and my action, in the best sense, form a unity. So the world's transformation. You've knowledge, you've experience, you've creativity, you have ultimate wisdom. And it's a knowing that is an action, that is a reflection on the known, which is a reflection on the action, and it's a continuous conversation. Now, what's all this got to do with, we've looked at the Beatitudes, we've looked at liberation theology. What's this got to do with Kendrick Lamar? Well, I find Kendrick Lamar an extraordinary character. I teach him on my theological themes in contemporary arts, theological themes in the creative arts. I write the songs by Lamar, by Nick Cave, and some Leonard Cohen, and sometimes we'll even go into Taylor Swift and Charlie XCX and explore different religious themes and themes around belonging, themes around responsibility, and particularly themes of social justice in these songs. And Lamar is really interesting and makes, I would say, an extraordinary contribution to areas of social justice, particularly institutional and structural racism in American society. If you think back to the summer of 2022, those of you doing the Leaving Cert now, you were probably doing the Junior Cert then. He brought the headlining act of the Glastonbury Festival across the pond there in Glastonbury. He brought it to a close in a very dramatic way. If you watch this video, you will see it. And you can actually see it here. You can see the crown of thorns. You can see the blood coming down. You can see him rapping. So he was singing the last song of his setlist, and the song is called Savior. And he kept repeating one phrase at the end: Godspeed for women's rights. They judge you, they judge Christ. The whole concert's up on YouTube. It's well worth a watch. Some people have accused him in the aftermath of this that he was politicizing religion and he was reducing it to mere entertainment. However, this performance of Lamar got me investigating his work a bit more, and he had a serious intention behind what he was doing that exhibits, on the one hand, his own faith commitment, but also his commitment to social justice. To look at the writings of Lamar, I have selected another theologian here, M. Shaw Copeland. She is a womanist and Black Catholic theologian. And she writes in an extraordinary way about the experience, and she theologically reflects on this, about the experience of being Black in America. One very short sentence she has in one of her books, but it says a lot, is this sentence here: incarnate spirit refuses to be bound. She maintains this, and she unpacks this argument. And by this, she means that the human person is a spirit enthroned in a body that experiences and lives a life. So let's go back and look at the sentence again. Incarnate. So inside that word there, you'll see carne, Latin word for flesh or meat. So incarnate is to become to become flesh. So if you look at New Testament writings, particularly the Gospel of John, for example, the Word was made flesh and lived among us. So the idea of Jesus as the second person of the Trinity becomes human. And as the second person of the Trinity, Jesus as God becomes human. And that, in theological language, is called the incarnation. And Copeland says that, in a sense, all humans are incarnated spirits refusing to be bound. Which is really a really interesting idea. What does she mean by this? She says that the human being is a spirit living in a body enthroned in a body that experiences and lives a life. But if you are a black person, according to Copeland, and if you're living in America, your experience as an incarnate spirit is very different to that of a white person's. Many black people struggle to live a life fit for their spirit, as they resist and refuse to be bound, not by their bodies, but bound by the prejudiced perceptions of their world, of their society. And yet, at the same time, many live lives that acknowledge the existence of God, even in a racist, materialist society. And what is very interesting is when you look at Copeland's theology and Lamar's poetic rapping, you can see a pretty interesting conversation happening between both. Lamar reflects many of the experience in his hip-hop rap that Copeland reflects on in her theological analysis. Lamar is a rapper, and he raps like a modern-day prophet. He raps about his fractured and yet faithful relationship with God, and he does it in fresh and honest ways. For example, here's a couple of lyrics from his song Faith. This is him on Glastonbury, a better image. You can see the crown of thorns and so on, the blood gushing down. As I said, I highly recommend you check out that concert. But here's a line from his song where he writes about his mind drifting while at church. And in the drifting, it leads him back to question about God and his life. I mean, how many times since you started watching this has your mind drifted? Our minds are always drifting. This is what he says in the chorus of Faith. I found myself losing focus at a Sunday service. Embarrassed, so I start questioning God. What is my purpose? He said to live the way he did. That's all he wants from me. Spread the word and witness. He rose on the first Sunday. I said, all right. Enthused that my Lord gave a listen, I opened my Bible in search to be a better Christian. And this from a person that never believed in religion. So what Lamar is saying here is he's talking about his own doubt about religion, but even though he has doubt in religion, he's also drawn closer to God and to Christianity through the scriptures and through the art form of hip-hop. The chorus that follows, it's as if he's reassuring himself to trust his own faith. What am I going to do? Gotta have faith. Life is too much. I'm just through. Where is your faith? Don't you give up. Don't you give in. Faith, all you need is the size of a mustard seed. So again, when I mentioned the Beatitudes, there's a kind of something hypnotic about the Beatitudes. Blessed are the rich, blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, blessed are the, blessed are the. And there's a kind of a hip-hop, an early version of hip-hop in the scriptures. And there's also a scriptural quality in Lamar's lyrics. And when we start to look at some of the scriptural ideas in Lamar, like the Beatitudes, in terms they're implicitly present in Lamar's texts, right? Then we need to go back and re-listen to him and reread his works. There are other artists that are well worth exploring. For example, Lauryn Hill, and she has an amazing song, Final Hour, and Childish Gambino's This Is America. Watch the video for This Is America, one of the best videos of a hip-hop song ever. Both of these artists creatively and sometimes shockingly represent their lived experience as Black Americans. Over here, I have an image of a book that I started reading, and it's a really interesting book. It's called Street Scriptures Between God and Hip Hop. And I've got some ideas from this that I workshop with my students, by the theologian Alejandro Nava. And Nava notes that besides the fact that in the ancient world, scripture would have been delivered in a lyrical and rap-like manner. It would be chanted, declared, and sung, always in a way that would set it apart from ordinary speech. The way in which the scriptures were originally composed bears a resemblance to the making of hip-hop, the two of them sharing a composite aesthetic. And when you listen to Lamar sing about his own struggles in life, you can't help but hear the prophetic tone in his own work. He reminds his listeners that when they're struggling with their own faith, particularly in times of suffering and stress, they're not on their own. One final thing that I would like to draw your attention to is the rewriting of the Beatitudes themselves that Lamar undertook with an Irish band called U2. And U2 were guest performers on his album Damn. And in return, Lamar was a guest performer on U2's 2017 album, Songs of Experience. And at the end of, I think it's a song called Get Out of Your Own Way, which segues into the song American Soul, Bono and Lamar rap this new version of the Beatitudes. They, in a sense, they rewrite the Beatitudes. And in their rewording of these, they offer an inverted, or I would say a flipped version of the Beatitudes, or a flipped blessing, not to the weak, not to the poor, not to the meek, right? But to those who weaken, right? To those who are rich, to those who are arrogant. And we'll look at them here now. Blessed are the arrogant, for theirs is the kingdom of their own company. End up in your own. Blessed are the superstars, for the magnificence in their light, we understand our own insignificance. Blessed are the filthy rich, for you can only truly own what you give away, like your pain. Blessed are the bullies, for one day they will have to stand up to themselves. Blessed are the liars, for the truth can be awkward. So you see in these lines, and this is the case in many of Kendrick Lamar's songs, the prayerful and the political acts are in conversation with each other, forcing the listener to rethink their conscience and the role they play in institutional racism in society. So that's just a little, I suppose, insight into the Leaving Cert section on Christianity in its origins and contemporary expressions. I think it's the Beatitudes are certainly key to looking at Christianity in its original expressions. And I think they very much form part of that matrix that drives liberation theology. But so too does the philosophical critique of knowing and doing. And I think if you prepare a question on this, it is always good. It's good for your own mind, but it's always good to see the interdisciplinary relationship between theology and philosophy. And then, of course, if you can engage with, you don't have to just go with Kendrick Lamar. As I said, there are other artists like Childish Gambino and Lauryn Hill. But if you can engage with an artist that advocates for social justice, and see how they implicitly apply some of the ancient sources and resources of Christianity, then you will you'll be on your way to doing a good exam question, I hope. My email address there, if you ever want to give me an email, or if you have any questions, or if you'd like me to recommend some books or articles. I've written up a whole series of articles, and I'll happily send them out to anyone who contacts me. And yeah, thanks for watching. I hope this helps, and the very, very best of luck in the Leaving Cert. Remember, it's only an exam, and don't let it get the better of you. Thanks for watching, folks, and take care and mind yourselves. Bye-bye.